In the last video we took a look at the question of what is rigging, and through that we explored an awful lot about the basic ideas and theories behind rigging, the things that we're trying to achieve and the ways that we need to think to go about achieving them. In this video I want to continue a little along that theoretical sort of line of thinking, to look at some of the ways that we need to organise our thoughts and our design process in order to help us have a starting point from which to begin creating our rigs and to know what sorts of systems that we really want to use in a given situation. Obviously this might be a very diverse subject and we could go through stacks of examples for hours and hours and hours, but hopefully this video will give you a broad enough overview to be able to have a starting point from which to think through things, as the general principles do apply no matter what kind of character or setup or mechanic or anything else you are trying to build. So what we're going to look at here are some of the basics of rig anatomies. Now you may instantly wonder exactly what kind of anatomy am I talking about. Do we mean anatomy, or do we mean it in a more general sense, such as the anatomy of a play, 3-act structure, foreshadowing, so on? And the answer is both. We're going to look at the design of rigs both from the viewpoint of the anatomies of the structures that we are trying to replicate, and also look at the anatomy of a rig itself. That is, the functional, structural, light wavy, in inverted commas, anatomy. To begin with, I want to have a look at how we think about structuring things before we actually get into rigging anything. This image here shows an example of a mechanical digger style arm which someone was trying to set up and wondering exactly how they'd get all of these little pieces to function together. Obviously this is the bucket here that does a sort of swing action, much like this, and all of these parts of the mechanic need to update and work with. The way to go about thinking this is to simply think about what we have already seen. We have seen that the tools available to us to build rigs are reasonably sparse and simple. This means that there are only so many kinds of simple mechanics and structures that we can build with those tools, and the best place to start with planning out a rig is to look for examples of where those structures will fit. Since the main articulation is the bucket itself, then it makes sense to put an FK controller of some description, I'll just draw an approximate bone here, and we can simply operate that bone and that will turn the bucket for us. All of this stuff we want to automate to match that. What do we have here? Well, we have a simple piston setup. Clearly, as this armature here tips backwards and forwards, then this needs to pivot and rotate. So it makes sense to put a controller here which targets towards this point, and similarly we can have another one here that targets back at that point. The most simple piston rig, which many of you might have already seen, of course, 2 items targeted at one another. That's all pretty simple, but what about these armature parts here? It's little things like this that often confuse folk. Well, it's quite simple. This is a fixed solid armature, this is a fixed solid armature. Neither of these need to be controlled directly by the animator or the user, but what they do form is a nice, neat triangle. Therefore, we can simply use an IK system. So we have a pivot point here, let's say this is a bone, coming to the next, another bone off, and then a goal item parented here, which would of course be a child of this bone. When this bone rotates, the goal will go. This big arm here would have its own main root bone. So this first bone here, which is the root of the IK chain, would be a child of that. This bone coming along here is simply a child of that bone, reaching for a goal. The bone that would be here, directing itself or targeting itself that way, would be a child of this bone, and of course the bone here handling the upper part of the piston would be a child of that one. Very simple. Target, target, IK, FK. Done. And here it is, set up in layout, color coded, so that we can hopefully see what's going on. We have these 2 bones which form an IK chain, targeting to this goal, or reaching for this goal I should say. We have these 2 bones performing a target, this which is just the master of the whole thing, and this which is our bucket. And when we rotate our bucket, the entire system flows along thusly. And there we have our action. and our rig is working as we would hope and expect it to. Very simple, and it's all about identifying these simple shapes and structures. You will also find that once you get into this idea and way of working, of finding the basic shapes that you can easily make bits of rigs for, it's easy to extend to other situations. So here we have another digger style arm which we will be seeing later on in the course, and we can see that once again we've got this block armature here which has two anchor points, one for this piston part and another for this rod that connects to the main bucket. Obviously in real life the piston would drive out, pushing this armature, which would in turn push the bucket, whilst the bucket itself has a pivot point and anchor on the main arm here, and of course this arm itself is a 1, 2, 3 pivot point arm, so again can operate on IK, and we have these simple anchor points for the pistons between each section of the hierarchy, and that gives us a result that can work in this sort of a fashion without any kind of problem. We can see that the whole thing reacts and does exactly what we would expect it to in terms of replicating the mechanic of the object, with only a couple of very simple setups, basically 2 IK chains and a few targets. This idea of identifying basic structures and reusing them again and again is also something that you will confront an awful lot in rigging, and which will inform the kind of choices of systems that you wish to build. Another good example of this is in the limbs of characters. Consider the difference between arms and legs. The essential truth is that there is no difference. They're simply 3 pivot or 2 bone chains. You have shoulder, elbow and wrist, and similarly on a leg you have hip, knee and ankle. Clearly what exists below the wrist and the ankle, namely the hand and the foot, are 2 very different setups in some ways, though not in others, but the main limb itself has no difference in operation. The kind of setups and control methods that we use for one is just as easily used for the other, since both have this same fundamental underlying mechanic to them. Limbs, as it happens, also give us another interesting example of this kind of working. For instance, if we're looking here at a regular, human or biped limb, in specific the leg, then clearly we're just using a 3 pivot IK system, or a 3 point or a 2 bone, whichever we want to call it. 2 bone is the most common, where we have the thigh bone and the leg bone, or the upper bone and the lower bone, and of course that terminates at the ankle. Action below the ankle is locked off and does not operate on the IK. For operating the chain below the ankle, we're using an inverse foot rig, similar to what we saw back in the hierarchies video right at the beginning. In this case we have the lift from the toe point, which of course operates the ankle up and down there. We also have a football lift here, which operates the ankle lift from the pivot point of the ball of the foot, keeping the toes flat. Now this is a simple and quite obvious way of working for a biped, but let us consider the difference in a quadruped. A quadruped limb is slightly different. We see that we have the thigh here, then the lower leg coming to the ankle, but of course the ankle isn't the end. This creature doesn't have the same heel position as we do, and so we have this third part of the leg coming down here. This can be treated as a 3 bone IK system. What we see is if we position the leg thusly, we have the action going on all 3 parts of the joint there. Now there are certain specifics to how you handle this 3 bone IK versus 2 bone IK in Lightwave, and we will come to that in due course in the tools and techniques section of this training. But what you will find is that there's no automated way for Lightwave to be able to get the right level of what you might call press between the 3 joints. You'll notice here that the majority of the action is happening at the knee and the ankle point. We have this extra controller here that lets us define how the leg presses. Essentially this upper thigh bone will point toward this extra item here, and that's fine. That's one perfectly valid way of setting up such a limb. But let us consider an alternate method. Here again we have a quadruped limb, and it's a 3 bone piece like this, and we have it operating off IK. But we have something different here. Notice how the major action is happening on the thigh and what would be the calf bone here, the first and second bones. This third bone isn't actually bending at all under IK, or rather its orientation relative to the foot and the goal here is remaining locked, which is exactly what we had in the biped. What you'll notice here is that we have essentially replicated the biped control. Our press now comes off of this controller here, which in the biped was our ankle lift. What we're essentially doing in this is using the same system. A 2-bone IK, this is the goal item here, not down here, and below this regular 2-bone IK part, we have the extended part of this leg plus the toes, which act together as a reverse foot system. This can be quite handy for animators, specifically if you're rigging for the same animator or animators repeatedly, or rigging for oneself, because it means that the control system between the biped and the quadruped is essentially identical. That means if you're used to animating one, you can jump straight in and animate the other. That doesn't make the control system that we just saw previously on the other quadruped less valid. It simply means that preference might consider this to be a more uniform design when setting up a quadruped limb and having it mirror more the animation control of a biped limb. This is an important thing to recognise because, of course, a quadruped limb is no different from a biped human limb. We see here on the skeleton of a dog, what we have is the hip here, we have the knee here, here is the ankle, or what on us would be the ankle, and here is the point of the toes. This is the thigh, this is the shin, this here, the metatarsals, is what we would think of as the foot, and then of course you have the toes coming off to the tip-toe point at the very end. The same is true of the arms. The arm of a quadruped, or the forelimb, is no different than our arm. We have the point of the shoulder, the point of the elbow, the point that would be the wrist, the metacarpals here, which would be the hand, and then the point of the fingers running out to the fingertips, as upper arm, forearm, hand, and fingers. This means that we can utilise the exact same setups, irrespective of whether we're rigging quadrupeds or bipeds, and once we find a good functional design for one, we can easily adapt it to the other without needing to reinvent the wheel. What about a slightly different quadruped, a cow? This kind of limb structure is what is called an ungulate, but we still have the same design here. We have a hip, we have a knee, we have an ankle, we have a toe, and then here we have the tip-toe. Ungulates, cows, horses, and so on, effectively walk on their toenails, but you still have this exact same structure of upper limb, forelimb, appendage, hand-foot part, and then extremity, toe-finger part. And again, of course, the same over on the arm. The upper arm to elbow, forearm to wrist, the hand to fingers, and the fingers to tips. You will notice on ungulates that there is this little bit of boniness around here, which does actually provide an additional articulation point. Ungulates can flap this, and there are different ways to build this into your rig depending upon how you want to take care of it, and we will look at such options later on. But one option, again, is to stick with the same simple 2-bone IK structure and just adapt it, as we have here. This guy is an ungulate. He has these goat-style legs, yet he still has a hip, a knee, ankle, a toe, and then of course at the base, where we have the root controller for the foot, would be the tip-toe. And this thing still operates on IK, just as before, but you'll notice that like the quadruped, it is just the 2-bone IK structure for the upper and lower limb. We get the press in the leg here by operating the ankle lift, and the extra toe flap is still available from the toe point, including of course the raise and tip in this fashion, which can be done thusly, giving full articulation but using the same control method. And this goes for all creatures. We're not just restricted to mammals. Here we have a dinosaur. He has a hip, a knee, an ankle, toes, and tip-toe. So we have this quadruped style rear limb here, but we have an ungulate style forelimb where we have a shoulder, elbow, wrist, a toe there, and he's actually walking on his tiptoes with his front limb. And it's the same elsewhere in the animal kingdom. Crustaceans, like a crab here. You'll notice, of course, that animals like this have these segmented parts in their limb, but not all of them are articulated. Notice this division here. This is not actually articulated. The crab cannot bend its limb at that point. You'll notice here on this bit of the shell where you have this little gap which allows this part of the shell to articulate into that opening, giving articulation. But what we have is the same structure. We have a hip, we have a knee, we have an ankle, and then we have a tiptoe. No actual toe point on this fella, but still a very simple limb. And once again, it's the exact same story for insects. Here we have a spider. He has a hip point down here. This is his knee. This is his ankle. This is his toe joint. And then his tiptoes are right there at the end of the claw, giving us this same structure once again. A common mistake with spiders, I will point out, and other arachnids, is this segment here that we see. This is, in us, essentially the kneecap. This point here is the one that articulates. This point here does not. Therefore, even though this may appear like a limb that has multiple articulation points and requires a more complex rig, the truth is it does not. It is actually this structure here. Of course, nature is pretty diverse, and this isn't absolutely true of all creatures. We see here a cockroach leg. Again, it is the same basic structure. In this case, this whole unit is solid and unarticulated, so the hip is essentially here. Then we have the knee, we have the ankle, and we go down to the tiptoe point here. But we have this spindly little section along there, which is multi-segmented. You have many little joints along here. Basically, like the individual bones of a toe, this bit can flex. And on a cockroach, this is kind of like a little spring suspension, just sort of springs back and forth, taking the weight of the animal. All of this here, even though it's segmented, is rigid. This last part isn't, and that can be trickier to rig, especially with IK. But we will see examples of ways that we can deal with this later on. And it is, of course, a specialised case. The majority of creatures that you would set up, at least if you're setting up creatures that mimic things that we see in the world around us, won't have structures like this. So it's much rarer that you'll come across something that requires a more complex joint structure and can't be dealt with either a very simple 2-bone or, if you prefer, a 3-bone IK setup. Looking at things in these sorts of ways becomes really important because, of course, what we see is that our rig is composed of little mechanical parts, a target, an FK, an IK, whatever. And similarly, the structures that we will be building, whether that be the articulated body of an animal or creature, or the articulated machine parts of a digger or vehicle or anything else, have to be compared against one another. You're looking for shapes and systems and points of pivot in the thing that you're trying to create and where you put those in your actual rig. In a way, it's sort of an exercise in theoretical comparative anatomy, if you will. Of course, once you start looking at various different characters and creatures, you'll see this sort of thing an awful lot. For instance, here we see a sort of standard quadruped shape. This thing could quite easily pass for either a dog or a cat or a squirrel or any number of other such quadrupedal animals, but it only takes a very slight shift in the limb positioning to produce a wholly different creature, and you've suddenly got yourself a dinosaur. You can notice, of course, that whilst the fingers have tipped down, the arms or forelimbs are pretty much otherwise unchanged, and the rear limbs are absolutely identical. It's just a position shift as to where the hip connects and how the whole body balances out. What this also leads us into, however, is to start noticing the differences in different types of anatomy that we are replicating in our rigs. For instance, with this whole deal of joints and rotations and pivot points, what we are looking at is the skeletal anatomy of a creature, where its bones are, how they are arranged, where the sockets and pivots of those bones are. But these are not the only parts of a creature that move. What we also, of course, have is the musculature, and you can think of this as having points of pivot and rotation also. Let us consider, for instance, the shoulder. The deltoid muscle mass here anchors up here at the top of the shoulder, and then again down here on the upper arm, bridging across like this. Of course, the actual point of rotation from a skeletal perspective is in the middle here. And we can see this same sort of thing going on in a variety of places, such as the pectoral, which anchors here on the chest, and again here on the upper arm. Once again, acting across this line, but bridging over the actual point of skeletal rotation, which is in the middle. This, of course, is how muscled creatures, which is pretty much all creatures, work, by having a muscle bridge a joint, and when that muscle contracts, it causes the joint to actuate. The important part to notice here is that it gives us something of a disconnect between the actual structure underneath, that being the skeleton, that is pivoting from certain points, and the surface detail and the shaping that we are getting as a result of those movements. And this brings us into an idea that there can be a difference between what we might call control rigging and deform rigging. We can make an excellent example of this with a muscle-bound character here. In the case of all of these controllers that we operate, what we are following is the skeleton. Parts, be that the shoulder or the elbow or whatever else, rotate from the point in the skeleton where the rotation occurs. Our control rig is basically an analogue for the character's skeleton. But these same points of pivoting are not necessarily so good for giving us good deformation, which is of course the shape coming from the muscles. Now, we can see the shoulder action happening on this guy, and we can see that it's pretty smooth. One of the things that I'm sure many of you are already aware of is the difficulty of getting good deformation across a shoulder, especially on a big, bulgy, muscly shouldered character such as this one here. The reason that it works so well in this character is because we have separated out our deform rig from our control rig. They are two separate rigs going on in this character. Clearly, as I've just said, this part that we're actually animating, the skeleton, is the control rig. But what we also have on the bones, or in this case joints in the character, is a different design of rig with alternate pivot points. What we see, of course, is that we have this joint here for the deltoid, which is bridging across where the pivot point of rotation for the shoulder from the skeleton is happening. We can see in bounding box the kind of action that this gives, and that helps us to control this shoulder mass. We can also see here a similar system down by the elbow, where we have a little bridge bone, or a bridge joint I should say, running across the actual point of pivot rotation for the elbow, which helps us to maintain the shaping and action going on there. This idea of separating out control rigs from deform rigs is a very powerful way to be able to get both efficient control methods for an animator to operate, an efficient character interface, while still getting a rig that deforms your character properly as you wish it to. This kind of structure can also provide us with additional benefits when it comes to troubleshooting problems with things like rotations, gimbal lock, Euler axis or Euler flips, because it puts us in a position where we can allow these things to take place on the control rig, but jump over those problems using the deform rig. Of course, also to avoid confusion, do let me just point out that these aren't two separate rigs. There is only one rig here. This idea of control rig, deform rig is really just two parts, the two major parts of the whole rig. The control rig is what we always use. The deform rig just targets over the top of it, and its movements are driven by our control rig. There aren't two separate things that we need to control or need to give to an animator. One thing that you will see very commonly is that people use combined deform and control rigs. In this instance here, the bones that we see in this rig are of course deforming the mesh, but also all of the motion control is set up on them. This shoulder only has a single pivot point, handling both its rotation for control, its skeletal rotation, but also its deformation rotations. In some characters, such as this one, this is fine, because of course the design of the mesh, the design of the character itself, lends itself to this kind of working. A combined deform control rig, it's all done in one. All of the motion control is done on bones, with maybe some nulls scattered about that are used as constraints or whatnot. But for other types of character, it is wholly useless, essentially. Just take a look around at all of the problems that people have had, as I've said, with getting good shoulder deformation. On a character like the muscly Hulk that we just saw, you will never get this kind of deformation going on with this kind of rig. We might, of course, present the argument that we could still build a combined deform control rig, whereby we of course just had a bridge bone here and then the next bone and so on, and to rotate the shoulder rather than rotating a single item, we rotated them both. And that's certainly possible, but again you have to consider what we were saying before in the last video about how friendly that is for an animator to use. Generally it's not so. You are much better off providing a skeletal style control rig. And if your character is of the sort where those pivots and that kind of bone layout can serve the deformation well enough, then that's fine. But with many more advanced characters, you will want to start looking at the differences between control rigs and deform rigs, and specifically how they relate to the anatomy that you are trying to replicate. The anatomy of your rig design must follow the anatomy of what you are trying to build, essentially. An awful lot of the time this will require a bit of thought or study of the actual little parts that you're working on, and we could go through tons and tons and tons of these. We won't specifically, but we will see a number of examples as we go along through this training. Another quick one that I'll point out here for illustrative purposes is the knee. Also a common deformation problem area for folks. If we notice, of course, how the knee actually works, it's not a simple socket like a shoulder, where you just have a bone here that just rotates in place. Rather, it's a sliding structure. You have the lower leg bone here, and of course the upper leg bone, the femur, there. And when the knee rotates, this lower bone here rolls over the surface of that bone, obviously turning as it goes. It's not what you might consider a traditional hinge point. Following then from this observation, we see a knee set up here which does use a bridge bone across the actual point of pivot rotation in the control rig, and we can see that when we operate the control rig we get this turn and slide action going on in the bones, which replicates to some extent what we see in an actual knee, giving us both a handy little representation of the articulation as well as, of course, this mid-bone, which can act as a hold structure for keeping the knee deforms just as we want them. So, with all of that seen and said, that pretty much brings us to the end of this video. I hope it's given you some pause for thought about all of the tiny little specifics that may well go into rig design. And of course we will expand upon all of these things further as we go on into the training and start looking at specifics of technique.